Boom! Hello, guys. I'm invisible Anastasia from Nature. My camera doesn't work. That's why today I will be kind of talking heads. But at the same time, I'm really happy to see you. Hello, team. Hello, Anna. Really thank you for following our workshops. Uh, today we will have a workshop with our buddies from Atium. Atium is a platform to engage new employees or old employees to make their lives better. And Mature helps people to find and hire remote developers, well, not only developers. And we also help with onboarding because while first weeks are the most important weeks on the candidate journey or new employee journey. And today we will speak about how to make this road easier and better and more, I don't know, happier. Um, so guys will tell you how to engage newcomers to your team, how to avoid this isolation, especially as we all see it like remotely at home or in co-working. So please, guys, tell a little bit about yourself. I will mute myself, and I will support you in the chat and ask a question box.
Thank you, Anastasia. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining the webinar. We're really happy and excited to do this together with Match HR, our remote hiring partner. So Guido and I are two of the founders of Atium. We built a startup that focuses on improving remote team culture by using fun games and activities. And today we're going to look at one of the main problems that remote teams face. I will let Guido also greet you, and then I'll get started with a little energizer so that we all get ready.
So my name is Guido. I'm super excited to be here, well, let's just get into it. Mario, go ahead.
Great. So what we would like you to do is just to, as a little energizer, write in the chat a couple of things. So just type in where you're calling from today, how your day has been, and also if you're interested in the topic of loneliness and isolation, more as an HR lead, a team lead, or just as an individual.
You're not sharing your screen yet, though.
No, yeah, I'll do that in a second. Maybe I can do it in the meantime. Maybe Guido, in the meantime, you can do your own check-in, and then I'll do mine whilst I share. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a bit of a stressful day. We launched one of our newest activities today, so that's been super exciting. Generally pretty good. Super excited about this, of course, and from the Netherlands, where it's cold, almost sundown, and looking forward to this.
Oh, guys, sorry,
Mario.
I did something wrong. I'm sorry, it was me. I will invite Mario to the stage again. I'm sorry. I tried to close my window not to interrupt the presentation, but I did something wrong. It happens.
All right, there is Mario again. You're now muted.
And I'm back, and I will share my screen again, and then we can get started. I'll do my check-in quickly as well. So, yeah, I mean, also in Amsterdam, not too far from Guido. I'm quite excited for this webinar. I've been looking forward to it for a while, but yeah, pretty stressful days. Always a lot happening. Just give me 1 second because now I need to reload it.
I see, Anna, that you've been busy as well. There's so many channels these days, right? I just got to enter the Clubhouse environment last week for the first time. So that's also another channel. But today we're going to do it here. Nice to meet you guys. Let's see if Mario can bring up the screen.
Yes. One more second. Good to see you, Anna, by the way, even though just virtually. All right. We should be up and running now. Let me know if you see it, and I will get started.
Yes, we do.
Great. All right. So today, the 4 things we're gonna cover are, firstly, what exactly are isolation and loneliness, so we can define the problem well. We're gonna look at what the size of the problem is. And then most of the presentation and webinar will be dedicated to looking at solutions to this issue. And then in the end, we'll see if there are any tips that come from the community, as well as have a Q&A session. If you guys have any questions, you can start just putting them in the chat. We'll be happy to answer them. We might answer them during the presentation or at the end, but please, let us know if you have any questions. We already did the icebreaker, so let's jump into what isolation and loneliness actually are. So the main distinction between isolation and loneliness is that isolation is structural. It's actually an objective measure of social interactions or lack of them. And typically when you look at it in the context of work, it relates to access. So an isolated worker can't get the information or feedback that they need. They feel like their achievements or development are being ignored. And in general, they might feel like they're actually cut off from the business. Loneliness, on the other hand, is emotional. So it's a perception of social isolation. Another definition is the discrepancy between a person's desired and actual social relationships. So I think something that's important to notice is that alone doesn't necessarily equal lonely, and vice versa. Another interesting thing about loneliness is that it's more closely associated with the quality than the number of relationships. Bob Dylan has a very nice quote in one of his songs that says, "Loneliness got a mind of its own. The more people around, the more you feel alone." I think this is a great quote because in a way it also really captures one of the paradoxes of modern society, where we are so hyper-connected through technology. We live in very crowded cities, and yet we feel lonelier than before. One important thing as well to know is that the reason why we are tackling loneliness and isolation together is that, as you can imagine, they are closely related. So isolation, as we defined it, obviously also can contribute to loneliness. But what's maybe less intuitive is that loneliness can also contribute to isolation. This is because when people feel lonely, one of the natural reactions is to actually become even more isolated and seek even less social relationships. Some other questions that I guess you might have are loneliness and isolation only a problem because of working remotely or because of the current COVID situation? The reality of things is that there are many factors that can influence loneliness and isolation. So I divided them into external and internal factors. Some external factors are living alone. That obviously increases the chances of feeling lonely. Fully remote work. COVID, definitely. But work culture is another important factor. if you have a positive work culture that actually addresses this topic, it can really help people to mitigate the problem. There are also some internal factors. Your personality can play a role, so introvert versus extrovert especially. And another interesting fact is that to some extent, loneliness is also heritable from your parents. Now that we know what loneliness and isolation are, let's look at how big the problem actually is. In order to look at that, we're going to look at two things. On one hand, we're going to look at how bad the consequences are or can be, and then we're going to look at how frequent the problem is. So starting with the consequences, you can have lighter or more severe forms of loneliness and isolation. Starting with the lighter forms, this can already actually have a significant impact on a worker. I mean, they can impact productivity, connection, and sense of belonging with teammates. And there's also some studies that suggest that sometimes willingness is a decisive factor in making people that are working fully remotely decide to stop that and look for roles that are at least partially in person. At Atium, of course, we believe that you can actually be fully remote and not suffer from loneliness, but it can be a problem if the right culture is not present and the right processes are not in place. In more severe cases, actually, you can have very serious consequences on health, both mental health and physical health. So loneliness is strongly associated with burnouts, depression, and anxiety. And it can actually even increase risk of heart diseases and mortality. And it can actually do so even more than obesity, for example. This is a little bit more common in elderly people, but it just shows you actually how much of an impact these problems can have on our health. Let's look at how common it is. So even before the pandemic, the New York Times had an article in 2016 where they mentioned that in the US, loneliness had become an epidemic. In the UK, there's data that suggests that almost 1/5 of the population says they feel always or often lonely. So it's a common thing, and it's actually a growing trend in society, even regardless of COVID. At the same time, these numbers that I mentioned are true for the general population. If you're here on this webinar, you're probably quite interested specifically in remote workers. And so let's look at some numbers on this category. I pulled up two graphs from Buffer's State of Remote report. One is from 2020, and it was from the beginning of the year, so before the pandemic started. And loneliness was the #1 struggle that remote workers faced, together with collaboration and communication. And 20% of remote workers said it was their biggest struggle. In 2021, it's now in second position at 16%. So still, one person in 6 says it's the biggest problem. It's partially good to see that it's not first anymore, but at the same time, the first place has been taken by not being able to unplug, which, as we will see in a second, is also correlated to isolation and loneliness. Because if you think about it, if you're not able to unplug from work, you're just going to continue working into your evening, and also that way decrease your chances of being able to find the solutions to loneliness and isolation. All right. So in a second, I will now pass it to Guido for some solutions. But just to recap, the main learnings that we should take from these are that there is a difference between isolation and loneliness, although they are related and so should be tackled together. They are very common problems, so it shouldn't be something to be afraid of talking about. But living on a positive note, there are also ways to manage them. And Guido will tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. All right. So indeed, solutions, what we're here for, of course. So first of all, what I really want to talk about is a little bit like how do we see the solution space, and if we think about it, there are both structural as well as tactical solutions. Structural means really solutions that are required, or like that you as an organization can implement, and that are more on a process as well as cultural level, that structure in a structured manner help you actually combat isolation as well as loneliness. Then tactical solutions are a bit more like one-off, implemented quick fixes that can help in that regard. Can I increase the size of the screen? I don't know. How did you do that, Mario? There it is. Cool. That helps, I guess. So I was saying, yeah, tactical solutions as opposed to structural solutions are a bit more quick fixes that mitigate some of the symptoms once they are there. And as you can imagine, you can both implement fixes on an individual level as well as on a company level. What we'll be talking about today is mostly structural solutions that you can implement on a company level because they're most interesting, but some of them will be a bit more tactical. And at the end, we'll have some individual tips that we won't go too much in depth about, but especially because we're sharing the slides at the end as well, you can read through them and see is there anything that you can help your employees with, or even yourself. In any case, the first step is really to be intentional and acknowledge that this is a growing problem and dedicating resources to solve it. If you cannot take that step, then also the solutions will, of course, not really work. Let's see. So we have 3 core pillars in which we see solutions that we can help with. So these are like the high level, and then we'll go into very tactical tips. The first is to build an open environment, where it's really to encourage open conversations with coworkers about loneliness as well as isolation. Then, of course, like having social interactions will really help combating that isolation and that loneliness. So facilitating them both with coworkers as well as people not from work. Like not all the solution needs to be in the workplace or in the work environment, but at the same time, as leaders, we can help also build those relationships outside of the work environment. Lastly, and this is when I will give it back to Mario, we can really also support our coworkers when they are experiencing problems, when we actually get to that state, unfortunately, which will probably happen, although we obviously try to minimize it as much as possible. So building an open environment where the goal is really to encourage open conversations about hard topics and stop making them a taboo. So basically, it's okay not to be okay. We have 4 practical tips in this regard. The first is employee pulse surveys. Obviously, one-on-ones, one of the most important tools in the toolkit as a manager. Then using games that encourage openness. And lastly, starting meetings with a check-in. So these employee surveys can really start opening up that conversation. What Peter Drucker once said, what gets measured gets managed. And that's also in this regard, or also true here. So if you make sure that you also check if loneliness and isolation are growing or decreasing in your organization, then you know a bit like, are my interventions working? Do I have an environment where it's open to actually talk about it? Then sharing those results, obviously in an anonymous way, can really help to structure the conversation and build that environment where it's open to talk about it. Once you have that, but also in general, encouraging managers to ask in one-on-ones is a core topic. Like just being very open. Like, is it too quiet at home? Do you miss having people around? Do you feel left out? And this is really, I think, on the one side, is really like where you can build that personal relationship in order to actually get a feeling of like, how are people doing. It's also a place where you can actually communicate strategy and culture very well, which is one of the major factors in isolation, where if people feel left out, that can really hurt also like how much they're engaged with the company. So that's really where one-on-ones can help. Then on a bit maybe even more tactical level, like having those hard conversations can be difficult. They're called hard conversations for a reason. And we actually developed a game that you can see here as well, that will help you actually bridge those conversations. So it's called Fact Bucket, where each player submits like a small fact about themselves, specifically related to a certain theme. So if you want to open a certain conversation, this can decrease the barrier to actually have that conversation, because everybody just writes it. You can vote like who's who, and then that really helps you then have that conversation afterwards, and bridging the awkwardness of like starting that conversation potentially. Similarly, starting every meeting with a check-in can really help as well. And a check-in, the way it works is basically you set the stage before, at the beginning of the meeting. You just ask everybody, how are you actually doing? Like, what are you bringing to this meeting? And it's a great way to understand how everybody's doing and read the room. The way it works is you go around the room, ask them that question, and just let everybody like respond with a short sentence. Key to this is that people do not react to somebody else's check-in. So it's really about like, what am I bringing to the table? How else is my life going at this moment? It's not about like having a discussion about that. We added some like specific versions of this from the happiness radar to the one gift check-in that you can that are linked in the deck that we sent later. So that was like really about how can we create an open environment to have those conversations about loneliness and isolation, and therefore actually combat it. Another is to actually facilitate regular social interactions. We really believe that you as HR leaders or leaders of teams can actually help by, again, reducing barriers for team members to interact with each other, with the organization, and with yourself. So we'll talk about another four tips that you can do at work. And then, as I said a little bit before, there's also another 3 tips that can help outside of work. So facilitating them at work is about offsites and retreats, optional coffee, and like organizing optional coffee and tea chats, doing energizers, and organizing a social fun hour every week or bi-weekly. To start with the offsites and in-person retreats, even though we are talking about like how does this work remotely, we do believe that doesn't need to mean that you never meet each other. Why is organizing an offsite or an in-person retreat a great way to actually combat isolation and loneliness? Is because it's very high bandwidth. Like that week or that 2 or 3 days will have a lot of bandwidth or information in the sense of like connection with each other that will last a long time. It's super easy. I mean, you can book a few days in an Airbnb with your team, or even go as crazy as GitLab does and organize a full-on festival with the whole company. We think like once or twice a year should be more than enough, especially if you have like regular other moments of social interaction throughout the year, to really keep up that vibe and that culture that you're building over time. So what might that look like? You could set up these optional coffee and chit chats. It's actually one of my favorites that we do regularly as well. In Sweden, they call it fika time, where it's really about like having just half an hour twice or maybe even 3 times a week, where you can like break the monotony of that week where everybody's just home alone. It's an idea where it's just half an hour. You schedule it in the team calendar, and people can opt in to join. So you basically set up this half hour, set up the meeting room, and people just join in, have that coffee chat. We do really recommend like adding a conversation starter, like for example, how do you recharge, to get that conversation going, because sometimes if in a remote setting, it can be a bit hard, because like reading that room is just like when you're all on video can be harder. So doing a bit extra facilitation might be necessary, and this is a great way to do it. Another way to actually like get it going or get meetings going is doing a short social game. Of course, we have a few examples that we've built ourselves, but this really helps for everybody to enjoy the meeting more, while actually getting to know each other a little bit better every time. So that means that like they will actually connect more closely. The easiest way to do this by far is setting up a social rhythm with Atium, where you will automatically at the start of your team meeting get a new energizer that you can do, and these are specifically designed to over time increase psychological safety, decrease loneliness, get to know each other. Or of course you can just select something ad hoc from the web. There's a lot of resources on energizers, so that shouldn't be too difficult. What I think is always interesting to do here is using different themes that can sensitize people to the meeting. So if you have a workshop about like a product launch, like you ask a question about that, about launching, like how does it feel to launch, or like how happy are you about this? And that way people get into the right mood. And obviously like a little bit of craziness goes a long way. We sometimes have to bring a little bit more energy because we're remote, and that's this is a great way to do that. That brings me to the same, or to the bi-weekly fun social meeting, sometimes calling it Friday drinks, but obviously it doesn't need to include drinks. Also doesn't need to be on Friday, but just focusing on work sometimes makes us forget that we're full humans, and adding a bit of play in there, which we also already alluded to some other points, but those were very short. This is really focused more on the play and the social side, setting that up bi-weekly or weekly, at the end of the week, to celebrate just the team being together, being humans. It's can be a lot of fun. Two tips that we have is, I mean, it's a great opportunity to play some of those longer games that you can cooperatively do, like Founders Club, which we launched today, or Among Us, Jackbox, or even escape rooms that have been developed specifically for this. And as you can see from the picture, for a little bit of extra fun, you can, as we had with Halloween, add a snap lens and be a different character for that hour. So those were some of the ways or specific tips we can have to facilitate regular social interactions through work. But we also believe, as I said already, we believe it's important to also think about like, what can we do to help people have those relationships outside of work? Because that loneliness doesn't have to be solved only at work. It can also be outside of work. So we think you should encourage boundaries. If you notice that it's difficult, you can even have a checkout every day. And lastly, we'll talk a bit about supporting local communities. Encouraging boundaries, what we mean with that is really, because with remote work, it's very easy to always be on. Like it makes sense to encourage like having those boundaries as an organization, because in the end, like it's a marathon. Building a product, creating a company, doing great work is a marathon, and it's not really healthy in the long run to have those daily sprints where everybody's on all the time. How do you do that? First of all, fostering a culture that rewards people who do not overwork. What we often see is actually that the opposite is true. Similarly, leadership needs to set examples. So that means not sending that email at 12 in the evening, but waiting for the next day. Or actually not even writing that email at 12 in the evening. Lastly, talk about it and encouraging time off for those personal relationships. Again, we have another link resource here that has some great tips, and that also brings me to the CEO Sid Sebrandai from GitLab, who really recognized this and saw that like often you have this peer pressure to work long hours, and at GitLab they're being super careful, as he says, to not celebrate long hours and hustle culture at GitLab. So what if you do notice that your team is actually always on? Then what is probably the most concrete way to make sure that they draw a line in their work and actually get off is to just do a checkout at the end of the day. That can either be an event or doing it even async through a Slack channel, but basically getting them to share what they did today, maybe what they learned. I mean, there's some different questions that you could use there. Just at the end of the day, make sure that that line is drawn. They can say, okay, this was what I did today. Maybe even this is what I'll do tomorrow. But that's just the end of the day. Everybody's at the same time, or async, like everybody does it at 6 or whatever your end of the day looks like. Lastly, to close the topic of connections or social relationships is like supporting local communities. So when I think there's a real benefit for organizations, and I think this is one of the most beautiful things about being remote, is that when team members are active in their community, I mean, it helps with this loneliness and isolation, which is super important. That's what this is all about, but it will also help you build connections that can help your organization. If you think about it, like one of the beauties about being remote is that can be global, and you're into all of these different communities, local communities that can provide inspiration or insights into your work that you're doing. So what can you do as an organization? Supporting local meetups, giving people the opportunity to work from a coffee shop or a co-working space where they can build those connections, and obviously like encouraging side projects, where I've even heard that sometimes this is frowned upon, which I find super surprising, but I do believe that the best way is to actually broaden your scope also beyond like the direct job that you're doing. So that was basically how do you build relationships, social relationships, and how can that, by facilitating that, how can you really help your team combat social isolation and loneliness? And Mario will take it back now to talk about supporting your coworkers when they are struggling.
Thanks, Guido. I will do the switch of slides, hopefully a bit faster this time. All right, should be able to see it now. So the third pillar, it's a very important one, is supporting your own coworkers when you notice that they're struggling. Supporting each other is critical, especially during these times. And if you think about it, right now, you might be one of the few people that your colleagues can have a social interaction with on a regular basis. If you're in the position of being an HR or team lead, you're also in a position where you might be able to promote structural changes to the organization. And you should also do your best in order to do that, because as we will see in the next slide, I think for this one it's important to actually look at it separately when it comes to isolation and loneliness. And for isolation, the main things that can be done are a little bit more structural. For example, making sure that workers have the right access to tools and information, bringing recognition in the open, and sharing with employees the big picture. on the other side, when it comes to loneliness, this is where everyone, regardless of the role in the organization, can help. And it's important, for example, to have some social calls, to encourage to use sick days, even for loneliness or mental health issues, as well as encouraging people to take professional help. So let's see these topics in more detail. The first thing that should be done in order to address isolation is to try to do what you can in order to make sure that everybody is kept in the loop of the bigger picture of the organization. As you can imagine, if you are a remote worker and nobody is really telling you how the organization is doing and how your contribution is helping towards meeting the goals of the organization, you're going to feel a little disengaged, and that can lead to isolation. So what can you do if you're in the position to influence this is making sure that everybody receives some regular updates where you both celebrate business achievements, and that can be at team level, department level, and also company level, and also outlining business continuity plans. Is very important also in these uncertain times. In terms of how you can actually deliver these updates, some good ways to do it are some town halls where the leadership team is present and delivers the updates. You can also use internal blogs or videos. The second aspect that you can try to facilitate to avoid isolation is making sure that workers have access to the tools and information that they need. I mean, this sounds perhaps silly, but the reality of things is that it's still a problem. People still feel like they should have access to certain tools or certain resources and information which they are not given access to, and that again puts them in a position where they feel like they're being left out, which leads to isolation. Sorry, just the last point on this. Obviously, in order to do this effectively, you need to be proactive and listening. It's not enough to just say, okay, we're giving access to everybody. Make sure you have either through poll surveys or the other tools that we explained before in one-on-ones, etc. Make sure that you also ask these questions. The third and last point that we're going to cover in order to support people fight isolation is to bring recognition and appreciation in the open. Again, as a remote worker, most of your efforts take place behind the scenes. And it's very important that the efforts and achievements are recognized, not only by your direct manager, but also more in the open. Some good solutions are peer-to-peer nomination systems, where managers or employees can put forward individuals for a shout-out or even a bonus. Google has been doing this for many years, where any employee can every quarter mention a person that they think excelled at their job, and they receive automatically a bonus at the end of the month. Another nice way to do this are company-wide Slack threads or team channels where you can share public thank you posts. Moving over to loneliness. And as I said, these are things that basically anybody can do regardless of the role they have in an organization. The first one is a social call. I mean, if you notice that one of your co-workers is struggling, or they mention that they feel lonely and isolated, offer to jump on a social call with them, grab a virtual coffee with them. I think there is a nice quote that I put on this slide, which is that, not every connection needs to be deep, But when someone remembers your name and or a little bit about you, you're less likely to be lonely. So make sure that you're there and offer to help in these small ways as well. Another important aspect is to actually encourage people to take time off. Mental health sick days are a good policy, and this doesn't mean like severe mental health issues necessarily, but also, as in the example I provided here, which I took from Doist, which is a fully remote company. It should also be normal that a worker can tell their co-workers, I'm going to take the day off because I feel like I'm mentally tired. I feel like I need to be outside, be with friends, and as a company you should encourage that. Lastly, especially if you see that the problem of loneliness is lasting a long time, you should also encourage people to seek professional advice and help. This should also not be a stigma or something to be afraid of. So we have a bonus slide here. I think we can maybe actually give it to you in the slides. It's a little bit more about like tips you can just have as an individual, even outside of your organization, to try to tackle isolation and loneliness. But I think, we can move on to the questions. And okay, well, first we have a nice animation of a pet that came in. But so that's it for the presentation. We'd love now to hear both from you guys if you have any other tips that you think are relevant and that we haven't mentioned. We're also at some point going to turn these into a blog post. So if you have some tips that you share and that we like, we're also going to include them there and mention your name. And we'll also answer all the other pending questions that you guys have.
Right. So I already saw that Tim had a question. What is the opposite of loneliness, and can there be too much of that as well? I do agree that to some extent, if after this packed 40 minutes of tips, maybe if you do everything, it might be a little bit too much. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there can definitely be too much, let's say, social interaction, especially for certain types of personalities, like obviously more introvert and shy people sort of get an energy drain from it rather than being energized from it. Although at the same time, even the most introverted person in the long run will feel lonely if there isn't any interaction. I think to answer the question on what is the definition of the opposite of loneliness, it's basically feeling like you are satisfied with your social interactions. As we said, it's more an emotional state, loneliness. So if you feel satisfied with the level of social interaction that you have, then you're not going to feel lonely. But yeah, you should also be careful, of course, not to force people to take more social interaction than they need or want.
I hope that answers it. I guess so. I think Beatrice asked, is the mood emoji question before starting a meeting to limited to a certain group size, or any recommendations on that? I was thinking a bit about this. I can see, I mean, if you're doing the check-in and obviously let everybody talk, and it's a meeting of 30 people, that might be a bit much. However, I think if you actually do the mood emoji question where everybody puts an emoji, that will still give you, I mean, that can go very quickly because people can just prepare that basically, and it will give you at least an indication, like, are there any outliers, right, both on the positive or on the negative side. I don't know if you want to call them out at that point in time. It depends really on the meeting, I would say. But depending on the meeting, I guess you can decide, do I want to make that more of a everybody just puts in their emoji and we then just roll with it, or is it more of a, like, we actually go through everybody's response there? I don't know if there's any other questions.
No, I mean, there were some that came in the chat that we already partially answered. I think there was a good one by Anna that asked whether different age groups suffer more or less from loneliness and isolation. Yeah, I mean, I replied, I think when it comes to working ages, actually there are studies that suggest that the younger generations or younger workers are suffering more. At the same time, if you look at it more from a broader society perspective, obviously elderly people might be the age group that suffer the most, but that's they're not in working age, so we should make that distinction. I actually have some studies, I think, that I can find and share with you, Anna, later, if you're interested.
All right.
All right. I think then if there aren't any more questions, we will wrap this up. And yeah, as I said, we can share the slides and the recording with you guys. If you want to reach out to us, you can find us on LinkedIn or just reply to the email that we'll send out with the slides. Thanks a lot, and have a nice evening.
And now we will also set that barrier and turn off work and
exactly. Please
stop working.
Try, yes. Start working again next morning.
If you're in Europe, of course.
That is
I will send the recording to everyone, so you will not lose these tips. Thank you, guys. Thanks to everyone for questions and for the discussion. See you on our next workshop.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Anastasia.
Thanks, Anastasia. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.